So feel free to come up and say hi. But I'm Noelle Lansford, and we're going to go ahead and get started here with Space Oddities, the Nebulous language of design systems. So this talk is geared more towards design systems, if that is of interest to you. Welcome. If it's not, welcome. We're gonna have a good time regardless. Hopefully, everybody can find something that applies to their work here. So, let's jump in. All right, it's Tuesday morning. For me, it's Tuesday morning. For y'all, it's a lot of y'all. It's probably the afternoon. But let's wind it back to the morning. Let's say we just woke up. It's Tuesday morning. Let's say you're a designer in design systems, and you've got your cup of coffee. I've got my cup of coffee. So make sure to refill yours. And, you're just enjoying the fall weather. It's just beautiful out, all good. Oh, we do my own Foley artistry, by the way. So this is my Slack sound. Jill, another designer, has reached out to you on this lovely fall Tuesday morning. Says, hey, the engineer I'm working with says that your button doesn't support full width, something else. You haven't logged in yet. I don't know. You might relate to the designer here, like, oh man, Jill is one of our top design system consumers and she's got this question about the button. Maybe she's had this question a couple times. I don't know if I'm ready to answer it this early in the morning. Or maybe you relate to Jill and you're like, I feel like I've asked the design system team 5 times already about the button with support, right? So you might relate to one or the other here. But what is really going on in these kinds of interactions, right? Well, we're actually going to break down some of those, vocabulary barriers, whether it be with our design system teams or our consumers, or whether it just be between disciplines on the team for design systems or product itself. So we're going to play a couple games. I love I Spy, Spot the Difference, and design systems. So we found a way to make it all work together. What are these different games going to teach us? Well, hopefully, we'll be able to uncover how the creative and scientific mind can work together, how small miscommunications can scale, and how to correct confusion at scale when that's happened. So let's start with I Spy. I don't know if you remember this book. If you do, this book has a special place in my heart, the specific one. But basically what I Spy does is it walks kids through a series of puzzles where they're going to have to interpolate what they're seeing on a page and a riddle. So let's take a look at one of these pages real quick. There's a lot going on. It's kind of overwhelming. It's kind of the point. But we're actually going to go ahead and play I Spy together. So I'm going to read the poem. It's going to be great. I spy a peacock, 2 swans in love, 4 arrows, 4 bunnies, a button dove, a BFF bracelet, a strawberry, a train, a clock, and a message of love from a plane. So in this specific poem, what you'll notice is there's certain things in the poem that are very straightforward, like a peacock. And then there's other things that are a little bit more abstract, right? Like we've got a message of love from a plane. We've got a button dove and 2 swans in love, right? So there's things that you're going to have to look at the page and as a kid, figure out what those things mean because you might not have seen them before. So we're going to go ahead and find one. Spoilers, it's a button dove. And I went ahead and kind of blew it up and you can see, okay, it's a button that's shaped like a dove. That seems simple enough, right? We have some buttons, some doves, and then, okay, this will be a button dove, right? So in order to understand our definition, and I promise this will relate to design systems, we're not just going to play I Spy all day, although I could. But to understand our definition of a button dove, we first need to understand what a button is and what a dove is, right? So here we go. What we've learned from our immediate surroundings on our I Spy page is that a dove is a white bird and a button is a small object that can be used to fasten things. Now, we didn't learn that exact definition of a button, but that's something that a lot of kids are going to know what it is already, right? And so we can use our immediate surroundings and our immediate knowledge to come to the conclusion that this thing both fastens clothing, could fasten clothing, and is shaped like a dove. So here is where it starts to relate to design systems. Is a button dove a button or a dove? Now, It may not have been about a button dove per se, but you've probably had conversations like this when trying to categorize different components, right? So, is a button dove a button or a dove? We're going to walk through it. Well, I think a great question to ask yourself when figuring out how to categorize something is, if I needed to take care of it, or another way to say that, if I needed to maintain it, where would I put it? Okay, so we have a button dove. Here's a real dove. Here's some real buttons. If I needed to take care of my button dove, where should I put it? Should I put it in my aviary with all of my live doves, or should I put it in my drawer of buttons? Now, if I put it in the aviary, it would be a very well taken care of button dove. I would feed it every day. I would change its bedding every day. I'd give it new water. But my button dove doesn't necessarily need all of that. What it would probably be happier with is going in with the drawer of buttons, right? And so sometimes maintenance can be cheaper. In this case, it's cheaper. Other times maintenance can be more expensive. So that's a good question to ask. How do I appropriately take care of this specific element? So for that reason, because we're going to put it in with the buttons, we're going to classify this as a button. Now, we went through that exercise. That's great. Now I have a very, very important question. What is this? Well, this is a button quail. Well, it's not a button dove, it's a button quail. So let's figure out if this is a button or a quail. Well, actually, according to Britannica, and whoever wrote this definition at Britannica had a lot of fun. I'm going to pull out a couple really great lines here. But we have this information. We have this scientific information of their categorization, what family they're a part of, what order, species, their typical, they're 13 to 19 centimeters long, those kinds of things. We can classify this based on previous knowledge and previous documentation that this specific thing is a bird. It's a quail, right? Just to call out a really lovely line is, they run crouching and zigzagging through the grass, but are capable of weak whirring flight on their short, rounded wings. That's a fun line. But all that to say, we know that it's a bird, right? So it's a quail, right? Okay, well, we've identified a button dove, we've identified a button quail, and we've gone through a process both times. So they were the same process, but taken from two different angles. The process that we went through is we observed something, we interpreted what that thing was, we categorized it, and we created a new vocabulary around it. But like I mentioned, we did this in two different ways, or in two different perspectives. The first one, the I Spy model, was the creative mind. We found something new in our immediate surroundings, and we described it based on what was around us. The scientific mind used what we already knew to figure out what we're looking at. So we have, previous records of things that we've observed before. So what's great about this is the creative mind and the scientific mind have a common goal. They tend to seek to understand the world around them with curiosity. Now, when you're making something new, you'll notice that those two perspectives also remain. The goal is creating something new, but there's two different approaches to it. The creative mind typically looks for new ways to describe things, to see if we can make something new by describing it differently. Whereas the scientific mind often utilizes established definitions to draw new conclusions about what we're seeing. So we're pulling from a known database, right? All right, so it would be tempting to say we should pit the creative mind against the scientific mind. And in fact, I think a lot of teams, a lot of companies end up doing this, whether on purpose or on accident. It just is a natural divide oftentimes. But I think what works best is when the creative mind and the scientific mind are seen as more of a spectrum. I think as I've been talking about this, I would imagine some of you started to get uncomfortable, like, well, I feel like maybe I'm the creative mind and the scientific mind. At different times, I do both. And I think that's exactly accurate. This isn't about designers versus developers, this is about, we have creative parts of our brain and we have scientific parts of our brain. Some people are going to lean more one way or the other, but we all have access to those different areas. So as you can see, there's, it's a spectrum. But oftentimes people, not necessarily even divvied up by discipline, but just people in general, will still lean towards a natural favorite. And in my opinion, oftentimes design systems teams tend to lean a little bit more into the scientific mind, and product designers or developers tend to lean a little bit more into the creative mind. There's definitely overlap, but I think that's typically where we see those teams lean. And I feel so confident about this, and I don't want to spoil all of this for you, because my good friend, Ben Callahan, who's going to be speaking tomorrow, has some thoughts on this, and he's graciously let me show a couple of his slides. He's got a lot of really great data about how product design and systems designs tend to be a pendulum of innovating and standardizing. And this will look very familiar, right? To what we just saw of the balance between those two things and how to have a healthy balance between that. So definitely check out his talk tomorrow. That'll be great to continue thinking about how designers on both product and design systems can work together, utilizing those different parts of their brain. But back to this, I want to mention this again of what you'll notice is I'm not saying that design systems teams are completely scientific either. And that's going to be our focus of the days, is more on the design systems teams. But even if we truncated this, right, you'll notice it's still a scale and it's still a spectrum, even if we truncate it. So we definitely have the creative mind represented in design systems, even though we're more on the scientific mind side. So all of this to say, let's play I Spy again, but this time it's going to be design system themed. All right, here is our poem. Get ready. I spy a button, an icon, and a CTA, a badge, a coffee filter, and a deadline. Oh, yay. Oh, man, I bet everybody would have a different answer as to which thing's the CTA, which thing might be the badge. Coffee filter, what's that? We all know what the deadline is, so let's figure out our vocabulary real quick so we can meet the deadline, right? So we're going to just pick one to really break down, okay? And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to see what the creative mind might think if we saw 3 of these in a row. Well, most commonly with teams that I've worked with, we kind of just look at this and say, hey, this is a button, right? Looks like a button, acts like a button. How did I get that conclusion? Well, when I'm using things across the web or on apps, typically that thing just feels and looks like and behaves like what I would understand to be a button. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, right? Same thing with the engineer, right? Nobody's going to be necessarily wrong. It's just different perspectives. All right, so the scientist might look at these and see 3 different potentials, right? Maybe it's a button, maybe it's a hyperlink. It could be this CTA thing that sometimes we throw in there, I guess. I don't know. And how do we get there? Well, we might pull from known sources. In this case, I've pulled up MDN. And what you're seeing is that there's a different list of attributes for a button tag and an A tag, assuming that you're working on the web. And so those 2 things would need to be maintained quite differently. You've probably had this conversation on your team before. So I think some false dichotomies when we pit the creative mind against the scientific mind can be, well, they're all just the same because they look the same. Sometimes we get the creative mind kind of saying that more often. You might find the scientific mind saying things like they all need to be styled differently because they're different things. We need a way to differentiate these things, right? Or you might have a compromise that could be a good thing, but in some cases it could be a more confusing thing. We need to find a name that means both things at the same time. Well, if they're 2 different things and you're calling 2 different things the same thing, that can get confusing too, right? So this is when we pit against each other. Some of these things scale into really confusing conversations. But if we aren't trying to battle against who's right and who's wrong, we may come to the conclusion when we work together that there are we can agree that there's a common style, and there are at least two ways that we need to maintain it. So if we do it that way, what we might find is that we can maintain by kind. So we have two different tags that have two different attributes. We're going to need to maintain those differently. However, we can have one singular style that's shared across those differently maintained elements. Now, this isn't a universal solution, but this is just an example of the kinds of ideas that can come out of working together to utilize the strengths of each other's identification process. And I believe that these are the kinds of agreements that are going to scale best in your organization. Again, not that specific solution per se, but those kinds of agreements working together and believing in each other's strengths. And I think both the creative and the scientific perspectives offer valuable insights in how to create and maintain UI. I think it's really important to say that both have value in both creating and maintaining UI. I think too often we see, oh, well, the creative mind should just create and the scientific mind should just maintain. And I really think that both have a lot of value cross-pollinating in both areas. Okay, we're going to play our next game. Spot the difference. Well, I love Spot the Difference. This is a pretty advanced Spot the Difference. We're actually just going to go ahead and jump into the design system flavor of Spot the Difference, and we're going to use, for the purposes of this talk, we're just going to call it a button. I'm sorry. We're just going to call it a button for simplicity's sake. But we're going to play Spot the Difference with this coffee button. Okay. So, can you see any differences? I'll give you just a moment while I refill on my coffee. Okay. Let's figure out what the differences are. They look pretty similar, right? But in this case, we have a drop shadow opacity difference. We have a different spacing between the icon and the text. And we have different padding on each side. And you may, your heart might stop. You're like, 14 pixels and 16 pixels. What's going on the one on the bottom? Well, this is something that a lot of designers will do. And there's a good reason for it. It is called optically centering, right? So we could just mathematically center it, and it would be mathematically correct to center it that way. But optically, we might have a little extra padding around our icon, especially if you have an icon component. You might give it a standard set of padding, and you might have to subtract that from the edge of your button, right? So in this case, we're assuming that our icon has 2 pixels that we're accounting for. So when we have that icon there, we're going to bring it in a little bit so it looks centered. Now, what we may find is we don't always want the icon, right? So we saw an icon true, and we're going to make a variant of the same thing, right? So this time we're going to have icon false, but oh my goodness, now the text isn't centered because we did that cool trick earlier. So now we have to create a rule, right? The rule is when the icon is enabled, we do the 14 pixel padding. When the icon is disabled, we're going to do the same spacing on the left and the right. Now I put an asterisk. That asterisk is going to come back. We'll figure out when we may override this rule, right? Things start getting complicated fast when we're doing these kinds of really detailed UI work. So we're going to keep playing Spot the Difference. Here we go. You ready? All right. Now we have 2 carts. What could the differences on these be? Okay. There's quite a few. They look pretty identical until I put red lines all over them. And you're like, what happened? But we have another case of optical alignment, right? So in this case, the iced latte and the price of the iced latte on the right side, but right up against the image, right? Whereas the one on the left side has a little bit of padding in. And this is another example of that. A lot of times when you're dealing with a curved space, like that border radius that's right there, it can make it look like it's hanging outside of the image. And so sometimes designers will scoot it in a little bit to make it optically aligned with a curved element. Same thing with the border radius there. You'll notice that the one on the right-hand side has 24 and 24, but oftentimes when you nest border radii, you have to account for it to make it look like it's the same border radius, but inside, right? This is all really nerdy technical stuff. Doesn't, this is just for the purposes of this conversation to see how these things can get more complex as we begin to build off of things. Now, not only is all of that different between these two, but same thing with all of the buttons, right? I still have those button differences in there. And so I've built with the button. Now I've made a card, and I have these really slight little differences between these two different things. The other thing, right? We mentioned that asterisk about that rule about the 14 and the 16. Well, now I've made my button full width in my card. And now that I've done that, I actually do want it to be exactly centered, and I don't want an offset. So when we now have a new rule that when it's full width in a space, we don't, subtract that padding. So, okay, this is the last version of the spot the difference. Here we go. Okay, what is the difference between this section of cards and the one next to it? Well, we'll just go ahead and spot the difference. This is actually not as bad. It's just static width versus dynamic width. Excuse me. Static width meaning when I grow and shrink my space around it, or like the screen size, my cards stay the same width. Whereas the dynamic width is going to grow and shrink as my section size grows and shrinks. So that's really the only difference, along with all of the other differences between the cards and the buttons, right? So we can really see how all of these little details compound. Here is a very important question, though. Just to take a big step back, right? This can be an overwhelming amount of miscommunication and feeling like, oh my goodness, if we just got this right and this right, we would really be, doing everything right. But let's ask a question. Do these two differences, right, impact the user that's trying to order coffee? Well, I think that all of the details that we talked about so far don't really impact the user that much. They can still see all of the images. They can still see the price. Both look pretty nice. It's not going to hinder anybody from really making sure that their coffee order goes through. So if it's not impacting the user, what business case really do we have? Or another way to say it, like, who is this impacting? We have all these small differences we've identified. They seem really important. So who is it important for? Well, let's talk about that. If it's not the user, who's it going to impact? Now, this is where we go back to our Tuesday morning fall coffee. All right. And we've got our friend Jill, who has, and if you're using Teams, it can be a whoop, 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 right? That's scary. That means somebody's calling you. But we're going to keep with Slack today. And we're going to take a big sip of coffee before we open our Slack to answer Jill. Here we go. All right, we're in Slack. We're doing great. Jill's full question is, hey, the engineer I'm working with says your button doesn't support full width. Can I put in a request for the design system team to support this? Our team could definitely use that. Awesome. Well, I said, hey, Jill, thanks for reaching out. Our button component actually should support full width. Can you provide more context for how you're trying to implement it? And by the way, this is a great way to engage with your consumers, is always ask for the context so that you don't jump to a conclusion too quickly. It would be easy to say, hey, it supports full width, see ya. But we like to be curious. So we've asked, what's the context? How's it not working? Tell me more. Okay. Now, this may have happened to you before. Jill has added Jamie, her developer, to the chat. All right. Jill says, hey, Jamie, can you provide more context on our implementation hurdles? You see where this is going, so you add your developer, Sunny, to the chat. Okay, things are going to get exciting fast now. All right. Jamie, the product developer, says, hey, sure thing. We're trying to do Jill's design, but the design system button doesn't allow us to make it full width. See those beautiful full width buttons here in this screenshot that I provided of Jill's design? It's not happening. Why? To which I will now tag my developer, Sunny. Hey, can you weigh in? I thought we already built out our full width buttons. What's going on? Sunny says, hey, that's a link, not a button. Buttons do that, yes, but links don't. Now, Jill said, oh, I thought it was a button. To which you say, well, it's kind of a button, but it's too late. It's too late. There's more coming in. And you know that you've been pairing with Jill and you've been calling it a button this whole time, but maybe it was a link and now we're going to have a confusing time. Jamie says, also, our content editor just wants the CTA changed. First of all, what's a CTA now? Will fixing the link support that? To which Sunny says, also, it looks like your cards are static. Our cards are actually dynamic. To which Jill says, oh, cool. We can do dynamic content in cards now? Yeah. Yep. We've all been there. So who does this affect, right? This affects our internal efficiency quite a bit. And I think if we were all really honest with ourselves, these kinds of conversations add up fast, both in designer time and developer time. And so lack of unity on the design system teams impacts consumers of the design system in ways that you may not even be measuring or know how to measure. I want to break down that interaction, right? What we saw was some internal language drift. When different minds, the creative mind and the scientific mind, don't feel understood or represented in our own, common language, we often revert back to our original vocabulary. You saw that happening with me and Jill, right? I just said button because I knew Jill knew what a button was and it looked like a button and I just felt like it was a button, even if it might have been a link, right? But it creates a confusing nebulous of communication barriers between our design system teammates and therefore our consumers. I've even been a part of design systems teams where, if it was me and Sunny talking in that example, maybe Sunny and I would have a hard time communicating about what a button is and what a link is. So because of this, right, efficiency is reduced. We spend lots of time consulting and redefining things that already had definitions, right? And consumers of the design system feel frustrated because they get a different answer depending on who they ask. And this can really lead to consumers feeling a lack of trust in the design system because sometimes when that's the case, the design intent and the developer delivery are different. And so back to consumers' trust being low in the design system. When this happens, there can be a quiet drift that happens where consumers start creating one-offs instead of engaging with the design system. Consumers might feel like the design system is too complex or burdensome to use, so they don't. And organizationally, it's almost like you don't even have a design system. So that's a bummer, but how would you fix it, right? That's what this is about. So what I would recommend is actually realigning internally first. I think it's really tempting to see your consumer starting to do all these drifts, right? And you want to, stamp them all out with like you're playing what's the Gopher game? I can't remember. But you're putting out all the fires, right? But I think it's important to really keep design system team and unity top of mind, top priority between creatives and scientists alike. And so I think a good rule of thumb for this is if somebody finds themselves frequently using a generic term instead of a team term, it's probably worth revisiting, right? And I think this gets into something that I want to be clear about, right? I'm not saying to create a custom term every time that your team is doing something. I think there's a lot of value in utilizing the language that's already common between creatives and scientists. So go ahead and utilize that common vocabulary and just agree to use it. You don't need to reinvent that. And then when you do agree on a custom term, like a button dove, right? That's a new thing. Use it when talking on your team and use it when talking to consumers. So yeah, this is a button dove component. It's different of a normal button because of XYZ attributes, right? All right. I think this is also important if you're on a design system team to have a consultant mentality. If someone doesn't get it right, be graceful. Don't police it. It's better to have a positive engagement with a team member or a design system consumer than a perfect one, even if you feel like it's the fifth time or it actually is the fifth time. Okay, a quick recap. I know we're coming up on time here, so we will wrap this up. What we learned from I Spy is that the creative mind and the scientific mind works best when paired together rather than pitted against each other. Scalable and maintainable solutions are born out of healthy collaboration between the two. And when categorizing something, a helpful question is, how does this thing need to be maintained? Vocabulary should be shared. One party may need to compromise from time to time, or a new term may need to be created. From Spot the Differences, we noticed that small differences here and there compound magnificently over time. Even if the end user is impacted minimally, the design system consumer is likely not getting the efficiency gains that they were promised. Organizational drift away from the design system can happen quietly over time due to lack of internal alignment on the design system team. So, really make sure to prioritize your design system team alignment first. And have a consultant mentality with your peers. Be inquisitive and understanding. Cool. We can go ahead and take some questions if we have time for it. Let me see. Let me check the chat here. See how we're doing on time. If anybody else needs the studio here. Let's see. Awesome. And Dale, feel free to cut me off whenever we need to end, but I'm going to take a look at some questions here.
Sure. From what I can see, there aren't any specific questions, but I guess, like, if anyone does have any questions that come to mind even afterwards, they can approach you in
Sounds
Gathertown
great.
in the conference space.
Yeah, I will be hanging out in the Pixel Cafe once I jump off of the stream here. I'll rejoin back at the conference, so I'll be hanging out there. Oh, it looks like Robin and Christina and might have
Oh, we
a
have
question
Robin,
real quick.
Christine.
See.
Maybe, do you want to copy those, Noel, onto your computer somehow, and then maybe you guys can meet up afterwards because I need to start the next talk
Yeah,
in this
sounds good.
studio.
Let me make
So
sure
sorry,
I
everybody.
successfully do that real quick before we end.
Thank you, Robbie.
Awesome. I've got it. Thank you. Cool.
Cool. Thank you,
All
everybody.
right.
Thank you,
Thank
Noel,
you
as well.
all. Bye.